Good morning or afternoon, whatever it may be for you as you listening to this. We are continuing our review of the text that will be looked at on November 15th in the midst of worship. This conversation circulates around our gospel text, which comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew. We are really nearing the end of this cycle of readings. It's called the Year A, and most of our gospel readings have been from the Gospel of Matthew throughout this past year. Beginning in really the end of November, beginning of December, we'll be starting our new year, Year B, and that year will be largely out of the Gospel of Mark. This text that we're going to read today is toward the end of the Gospel of Matthew. It is a text that Jesus proclaims as he is preparing the disciples for his departure, as he's preparing them and us for a time in which he is away, and we are stewards of all that he has given us. Stewards of our time, talent, and treasures, but perhaps even more significantly, stewards of the gospel itself. Jesus is counting on his disciples to carry on, to administer in the household that he has given them, to minister to the people that he's given them, to minister with the gospel he has given them in his departure while he is away. We look forward to that glorious day when he will return. Many of the texts today, as they will next Sunday at some level, deal with our waiting of the day of the Lord, our waiting of God's kingdom to come. But the truth is we are in the middle times, right, between his first coming and his last. And to live in that time richly, we would attend to lessons like today's, which will talk to us about our responsibilities and the gifts and the things with which we are entrusted. So, from the Gospel of Matthew, the 25th chapter, beginning at the 14th, ending in the 30th verse. Jesus said to the disciples, "For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trusted in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew that you are a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.'" Here ends this reading of the gospel. Well, there are many things that one can say about this evocative parable of Jesus. The first thing is that while it is tempting, we want to make sure we don't too over-allegorize this. The parables are meant to teach a lesson, or teach lessons, I suppose, to let their narrative and let their story kind of resound in us and shape us and form us and apply our story to it. So we want to look for the lessons within the story and be careful not to completely allegorize. But there are ways in which I guess, we have a tendency to connect these things. So we'll also look at those. The first thing is, I think that the first layer that we should look at here is simply the role that these slaves had. They were all entrusted as stewards, would be a word we could use, of these talents that they were given. Stewardship is a word that's used a lot now when it comes to ecology, but it's really a Christian sense. It is a sense of being not the owner of something, but the caretaker of something, in charge of something. Like the owner, one can utilize and enjoy the things they're a steward over, but they always do so with an eye to the fact that this is not theirs. That whatever this object is, or whatever this gift is, or whatever these resources are, whatever these talents are, they're really ultimately God's, and this person is just a steward, a caretaker over them, and should use them in a way that would please the owner. So that idea is one that we should recognize as kind of a defining way in which we understand ourselves as Christians, that we are stewards, that we're tenants, that we're caretakers. I spoke to this a little bit in the beginning. What are we caretakers of? Well, of everything. Right? All these things are given to us by God. Our time, our talent, our treasures is one of the simple ways kind of stewardship drives and those kind of things have talked about our resources. But it's more than that. Again, it's the very gospel itself. I mean, it's our families, it's our lives, it's our passions, it's our dreams, it's our abilities, it's our literal talents. All of these are really gifts of God, and the question is, how do we use them in a way that glorifies Him? This question should be a predominant question just in our lives. It's a great paradigm for understanding who we are. If you're to look at yourself as a child of God, that's a great paradigm. What does it mean to be God's child? Right? A disciple. What does it mean to be a disciple, a follower? But an equally powerful and meaningful paradigm would be, what does it mean to be a steward? Right? That God would entrust us with all of these things and until His return. So this is a story about stewardship. And in the end, it's a story about 3 slaves that were entrusted their property to them. Right? 2 end up being faithful in that entrusting, and they receive 5 and 2 talents respectively. Now, it's probably significant for us to just mention what a talent is. It's interesting how that word has become, for us, something that talks about our abilities, right? Our talents. And appropriately so, I think, as this parable really grew in recognition and in common usage, what had become a monetary denomination became an image for much more. And this is not just a story about how we invest our money. This is a story about how we invest ourselves, everything that we're entrusted with. And as thus, that word talent that used to be just about money has been brought in to also mean our abilities, and I think appropriately so. But as a sum of money, we should recognize that a talent was a very significant sum of money. It probably equated around 15 years of an average income. So, I guess it depends on what you'd say the average income is, but you might have anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 that it would be in a talent, right? 15 years worth of an average income if it's who knows? It'd be somewhere around that number. So just keep that in mind. So one's given, what would it be? 75 years worth of someone's average income. I mean, what someone would make, beyond a working lifetime, 75 years, they get that much 5 times or 3 times or 1 time, an incredible amount of money. So this was not just change. This was not a couple bucks. This was a significant sum of money that each are entrusted with, regardless if it was the 5 or the 2 or the 1. So that's the first thing to notice, that this is an abundant thing. And then you notice that the 2 people who are rewarded in the end, whose stewardship is recognized as being good and trustworthy, who then, in response to that, are given even more and are then invited into the joy of the master. These two, what do? Well, they invested in certain ways. We don't know how, but whatever they do, they utilize these resources, these talents, this gift that God has given them, or there I am allegorizing that the master has given them. They take these things and they utilize them in such a way, invest them in such a way that they multiply. Right? What would it must have been to do that? Well, they would have had to, certainly in my mind, had a plan of some sort. They would have had to have some trust that the master trusted them to try and figure out how to invest this. They must have had some desire to see their master benefit from the gifts that they had entrusted to them, right? On the other hand, we have this individual who takes the one talent and buries it. And we have kind of an elaborate kind of confession on this person. And this person says, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." Well, I suppose if he was that way, if the master was someone who reaped where he did not sow and gathered where he did not scatter seed, maybe he would have approved, if he was a harsh man, he would have approved of what this person did, but he doesn't. He said, did you, that I reap where I do not sow and gather where I do not scatter? I think what's interesting about this is it's obvious that this other person that was given the one talent doesn't know the master, right? Simply does not know the master. Is operating with a view of the master that is contrary not only to what we know to be the master if we allegorize this and mean to be God, but what we fundamentally know within the story to see the master. Because here the master is clearly sowing and scattering seed, right? It's in 5 talents, it's in 2 talents, and in 1 talent. This is investment, this is seed money, right? This is an attempt to kind of underwrite whatever kind of work that these stewards, that these slaves, that these servants, that these tenants found possible, right? Commensurate with their abilities, he entrusted them to utilize their abilities. We're told early that he gave according to their ability, right? And he gave them talents. 2 of the people trust that the master wants them to use that and invest that and figure out how to trade for it and make it prosper to their benefaction, as the story shows, but also to the master's glory. This one decides nothing of the matter, but instead operates not in faith in the good intent, faith in the generosity of the master, but instead in fear of punishment, fear of the lack of generosity of the master, the harshness of the master, the judgmentalism of the master. And because of that, he just buries it. And he receives exactly the negative thing that he kind of self-prophesied would happen. Instead of coming to the master in faith, he came to him in fear and in accusation. He came to him and didn't acknowledge the wonderful gift that he'd been given. And he buries it. And that's judged. This is not so much that it's a story of 3 people who make different investments and 2 make wise investments and 1 makes a poor investment. It's that 2 invest and 1 doesn't. This parable invites us to invest. It invites us to recognize that God has blessed us and entrusted us with our time, talent, and treasures, right? With our talents, however you might describe those, with the very kingdom, right? With the task of showing forth his son's truth, living out his way. He's entrusted us with his very spirit. to dwell in us, to inspire us, to move us. And we should, with boldness and with eagerness and with faith, let that seed continue to spread. Invest it. See if it doesn't grow. And hopefully come back many times what was planted. But if we just bury all of that, we really deny God's goodness. We deny the faith that he put in trusting us. We deny his ability to grow, to have seed that is fruitful, that's worth sowing. Right? We deny the talents he's given us. So hopefully that helps kind of a little bit in this text, make you recognize really, I think, what the failure of this third servant is. And it's the third servant is really, he didn't approach the master with faith, but with fear. And as we look to God, we should not approach God first with fear, but there's an awe. That's obviously appropriate. But we approach him with a trust. And we approach him with gratitude for what he's given us. And we approach him with a zeal for sharing that. There's a certain freedom we have as Christians. We know that God loves us and protects us and saves us. I suppose if the person with 5 talents went off and invested and it didn't happen, and somehow those talents didn't produce as they would have liked, I think God would come forward graciously. But there's a slight promise in this text that the talents God gives us, if we give toward his purposes and toward his glory, will produce. And that's part of what's indicated here. There isn't that negative example. So go ahead and do it. And the worst thing we can do is to just bury those things. The worst thing we can do is not to use them, and to not trust God that he gave them to us, and not trust God that he can make them work for his purposes. Don't ignore the gifts God has given you. Don't ignore his word. Don't ignore prayer. Don't ignore doing his work. Because the more we ignore those things, the more we forget those things, the more we deny those things, the less likely we are to resource them and to use them in the future. It just kind of, you forget those things, right? Just like abilities. And if you practiced an instrument when you're young and you've not practiced for years and years and years, and you pick it up, you lose a lot of that talent. Let's not lose the gifts God has given us to show forth his glory and his goodness in this world.